Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
As is customary, Theresa May clashed with Jeremy Corbyn today over her leadership capabilities. It was the last PMQs before Parliament's summer break. She also faced questions on the Brexit negotiations. Lots of legislative work still needs to be addressed. That goes without saying, doesn't it?
Through this two-year period, what the end-state relationship for the UK and the European Union will be in the future. It will then be necessary to have an implementation period when people are able to adjust to that new end state that is coming in. There'll be some very practical things that will need to be done during that period, and as part of the negotiations it will be important for us to agree what that implementation period or periods is and what the arrangements will be during that.
Well, joining from our Westminster studios, Harry Cole, Westminster correspondent for The Sun, and Shihab Khan, a political columnist for The Independent. Gentlemen, a very good afternoon to both of you. Shihab, if I can start with you. Dan Hodges of the Mail on Sunday and elsewhere, around about this time we were debating politics with him. He's just tweeted saying, job done for May, she's made it through to the summer.
Yeah, it's been a very difficult period for Theresa May in the last few weeks. She's had to fend off her cabinet sort of ripping each other apart, a series of leaks. She's come off the back of an incredibly difficult and poor general election campaign where she's lost a lot of credibility. Her approval ratings are the worst they've ever been. And she's managed to get through and just about cling on to power. She goes into this recess hoping that by the end of it she shores up her position as Prime Minister and fends off any potential coups.
Harry, she goes away, summer break, walking in the hills, all the rest of it. What does she need to do?
I think everyone needs to stop, take a deep breath, have a little bit of rest. I mean, it was a surprisingly mute PMQs for the last one of the year. Normally, you know, David Cameron would love to send his troops off with a big cheer, some good zingers, some good jokes, but it really shows how far we've come in the last few months that everyone just looked like they wanted to get out the door and get onto the beach. She needs to, you know, she needs to just carry on. She needs to govern, and you know, away from Parliament where she's lost a majority, she can actually do that. You know, once things are broken up for the summer, you know, the government ticks on, and she'll be hoping that she manages to tick on. She'll be hoping that the sting is taken out by some of the plotting. I know there's been the Prosecco plots and lots of summer parties where cabinet ministers and ministers have been getting gently refreshed and slightly overheated, and there's been lots of whispering. There's a lot of whispering campaign. There's been no sort of actual movement against her. So I think a couple of weeks quiet reflection and see what happens.
Shihab, on this PMQs, I mean, you know, for a Prime Minister who her critics say has lost a lot of her authority, there she stands at the dispatch box. I mean, she may be a little bit of a diminished figure in the House since she started a year ago, but not that much.
I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. I think she's in a position now where her own party don't want her to lead them into the next general election.
I just mean PMQs, Shihab. Just strictly speaking about PMQs, she's not completely reduced in that setting.
No, I mean, obviously not. She's the Prime Minister, so when she stands up at PMQs, she is still the Prime Minister. What we saw today was a repetition of what we'd seen at PMQs for the last 4, 5, maybe even 6 years, where the Tories were quite keen to talk about their economic record. That is something that Theresa May didn't do during the general election campaign, and something she was keen to really push forward during these PMQs. Again, Labour's response was to talk about living standards, something that we've seen at PMQs for the last 5 or 6 years. It was really more of the same and much of the same. Theresa May's difficulties don't really lie at PMQs, it lies with the general public, where her approval ratings are worse than they've ever been before.
It's interesting, wasn't it, Harry Cole? I mean, there she was armed with that IFS report suggesting that inequality had fallen since the financial crisis. She was able to repeat that statistic that, 27% of the richest pay, or 1% of the highest paid earners pay 27% of all income tax. Some of the arguments you could argue she ought to have been rolling out in the general election.
Absolutely, and you'll see Philip Hammond sitting next to her probably thinking that exact thought. Michael Fallon last night made a very passionate defence of Conservative values and fiscal competence and talking about the economy. But Theresa May, in the arena of PMQs, is actually still quite lucky for Jeremy Corbyn, for all his legion of supporters and his surge and, you know, his good general election campaign he perceived to have had. Actually is still pretty bad at PMQs. He sticks very rigidly to his script. He had some good lines, but he didn't really read them with any flair. And actually, he doesn't really land that many blows. I thought it was quite interesting when he started to talk about the Prime Minister being devoid of reality and giving her a reality check. If he can get that sort of theme going, and if he can return to that constantly and get that to stick, I think it could be very damaging. But he's so scatty at the dispatch box that, frankly, there wasn't much to bother her over today, and she did manage to sort of steamroll her way out of difficult questions.
One thing he did do, Shihab, was point to the front bench and say, you know, look at those plotters amongst you, look at the signs of rifts and division. We'll probably hear that again, won't we? But coming to the summer recess, the Prime Minister goes away and has to think hard, really, about whether it is possible to paper over the cracks or whether she needs to get the axe out.
Yeah, she has a very difficult decision to make, and we know that she's going to be Prime Minister for a significant period of time. I think it's incredibly unlikely we'll see Theresa May be pushed out before the Brexit negotiations. We now go into a period which is critical for the future of this country. These negotiations will determine how prosperous we are, how we perform politically, economically, socially for years to come. And what Theresa May needs desperately is a united cabinet. If she's constantly sort of peering over her shoulder, considering who's plotting against her, thinking about leaks, thinking about what's going on in Westminster, she's going to struggle with these Brexit negotiations. This recess provides the perfect opportunity for her to sort of put everyone in line and make the necessary decisions to ensure we have a united government going into these negotiations.
Harry, one of our contributors earlier, Kip Malthouse, the Andover MP, was talking about in Bolton. He was saying, look, there's an argument that says if she can just stick at it, if she can just stick at the job, being managerial and quietly effective, we may have reached peak Corbyn and people will start to appreciate the doughtiness, the doggedness of her sticking to her knitting.
That's the thing what the Tories are clutching at now. They're hoping that they can paint Jeremy Corbyn as a politician. If they can, they were very excited when they managed to pin him on this U-turn over student fees. If they can make him paint him as just another ordinary politician who goes back on their promises and doesn't, says one thing to get into power and then does another once they're or after an election, then I think they could be onto something. For Theresa, I think, and for Brexit, for the summer, frankly, I think a spell out of Parliament is good for the Brexit negotiations. You know, we've got lots of people who are not in the room talking with great authority as if they are in the room about how things are going. And, you know, the Labour Party are desperate for some form of relevance, so the more moderate pro-European Labour MPs are stirring up all sorts of trouble over Brexit. And, you know, with a long period of summer, we can actually get on with the negotiations. We've got, you know, penciled in meetings between David Davis and Barnier for August, for September. And once we get to the autumn, we can actually see whether enough progress has been made to be able to start talking about trade agreements as well.
And Shihab, just one final thought, really. If you are Jeremy Corbyn, if you're a Labour activist, I mean, there is a feeling perhaps this might not be the quietest summer. The campaign footing continues to some extent.
Yeah, Labour's plan is over the next few weeks is to campaign in almost 100 marginal seats. The idea is that the momentum that Labour has gathered over the last 6, 7, 8 weeks or so will now be pushed forward through this summer period. Jeremy Corbyn is planning to visit 50 marginal seats across the country. What Labour needs to do, what Jeremy Corbyn needs to do, is continue pushing forward and continue providing effective opposition, which is crucial to us, like I mentioned, with the Brexit negotiations, an incredibly important period. We need an effective opposition. We need good governance and effective opposition to ensure we get the best deal possible, and Jeremy Corbyn needs to provide that.
I bet Theresa May is absolutely praying that none of her MPs go away this summer and think about giving up being an MP, because the last thing she needs is a by-election. Shihab Khan, Harry Cole, thanks both very much indeed.
Get more on that now after a feisty exchange in which Jeremy Corbyn challenged Theresa May over public sector pay, with one of his MPs accusing her of being an interim PM. Joined by Owen Jones from The Guardian and Matt Chorley from The Times. Hello to you, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Owen Jones, to you first of all. He's having a pop at her, but he's not Prime Minister.
Well, no, but as has been pointed out, she's an interim Prime Minister. She's a Prime Minister who has absolutely no authority whatsoever, which is why the Tory party, well, it doesn't have any internal discipline anymore. There's a fascinating report, quite colourful report, in the Sunday Times at the weekend. And to be honest with you, the profanities that Tory MPs are describing themselves in are such that I can't actually say them on national television. Suffice it to say, they're threatening to kick each other in some relatively sensitive areas of human anatomy. Equally, you've had apparently David Davis yelling at Boris Johnson that he's a failure. You've got obviously huge briefings against Philip Hammond, though he hasn't helped himself by making sexist remarks and calling public sector workers overpaid when he's on a salary they can only dream of. So the Tory party clearly are in a mess. Yet, of course, she is still technically Prime Minister. To quote a former colleague, George Osborne, though, she's the walking dead. And that's because she went into an election which she expected would crush Labour as an electoral force and ended up losing a majority. And now, you know, a lot of pundits who certainly don't have my politics think Labour have a very good chance of Jeremy Corbyn of forming a government at some point. And the only thing uniting the Tories at the moment is utter, total blind panic at losing and Jeremy Corbyn becoming PM. It's not exactly a recipe for strength and stability. And if you talk to EU diplomats, as I keep doing, they regard this wonderful country as a laughingstock. And that's not because we actually are. It's because our government has no authority and has made a bit of a fool out of themselves.
OK, Matt Chorley?
I actually thought in PMQs today Theresa May did better than she has done for the last few weeks. She sort of suddenly found the Tory economic argument that completely eluded her during most of the election campaign, and took on some of Jeremy Corbyn's arguments about public spending and public sector pay and whether or not there is a magic money tree. So it felt like she'd got a bit of oomph behind it that was lacking during the election campaign. She also picked Jeremy Corbyn up on this. It is a tricky situation he's got himself in over tuition fees. The Labour manifesto promised to scrap tuition fees, but then a few days before the general election happened, he gave an interview to NME where he said he was going to deal with the debt that people had already run up, which was then written up by the NME as him vowing to deal with it. Lots of people might have took that as meaning that he was promising that if he became Prime Minister he would scrap historic debt for tuition, and now it's not a promise, it's an ambition, and it's something they might like to do in a future world where Jeremy Corbyn is king. So I think it's interesting now that I think maybe the specifics of Labour policy are now sort of coming under scrutiny that it probably didn't in the same way during the election campaign.
Well, it's interesting on those two issues because, Theresa May did this big, passionate defence of freezing public sector pay, which in practice is a freeze. Some have experienced a real terms cut of 14% because you've got to take into account inflation. I don't often quote Ronald Reagan, obviously, but he once said, when you're explaining, you're losing. And I think that's the problem with Theresa May and other Tories' defence now of public sector pay freeze, freezing or real terms cuts of the pay of nurses, of teachers, of doctors, of police officers. It's back to when the Tories were defending opposing the minimum wage, which they did when it was introduced. They had all sorts of arguments. It would cost jobs, it would be economically reckless, businesses would lose. But ultimately, the electorate didn't look at those detailed arguments. They just saw the Tories were on the wrong side of an argument. And I think that's the problem with the public sector pay fees. On tuition fees, I mean, I'm not quite sure where this whole argument is coming from, because the manifesto which Labour issued didn't have any promise whatsoever to abolish past debt. It said that it would scrap tuition fees for future students. What Jeremy Corbyn said was that they would look into the issue of existing student debt. So obviously there's a choice between a Labour Party.
He said, I will.
Yeah, he did.
He said, I will.
I've seen the transcript.
He said, he
said he'll look at.
Stand by,
I will deal
Go
with
on.
it.
So, hold on a second,
he
boys.
used the phrase.
Hold on a second.
He used the
hold on a
phrase.
second. Hold on a second. You go.
Jeremy Corbyn used the phrase, I will deal with it. And it goes back, you know, and people have likened it to the vote leave bus. Was it promising that money to the NHS or just saying maybe we could? If he wasn't in any way trying to suggest that he was going to write off, cut, reduce, deal with historic debt of students who'd run this up in the past, then he should have just said, my focus is just entirely what's in the manifesto and its students going forward. And he didn't do that. He talked around the subject. He said, I will deal with it, so that some people would think he was going to do something which actually he wasn't promising to do.
No. What he said, he gave a number of options, actually, which he would look into, including extending the payment period, for example, of student debt. He didn't give any promise whatsoever. And there is a difference. I mean, this is why this is such an absurd argument. The Tories, on the one hand, support continued student fees so that young people are continually punished for aspiring to an education, and oppose, obviously, any writing off of any debt. That's never going to happen. Labour, on the other hand, have said they will get rid of those for future students and will look into whether it could be scrapped for existing students. So, I mean, if people are going to go, well, students now are going to look at this and go, well, blimey, I'm not going to vote Labour now, I'm going to vote Tory instead. I think that's very naive. And actually, if you look at the polling, a lot of the people who particularly object to tuition fees are actually parents who don't want their next generation to be lumbered with debt. I don't want my future kids to be lumbered with debt either. I'm sure you don't either. So I don't think it's just about this idea that young people are greedy, selfish. The only reason they voted Labour was they were bribed. They voted Labour, if you talk to people, I went across the country, I'm sure you did as well, and when you talk to young people, they came up with a whole range of issues, from the NHS to tax justice to the economy, to asking rich people to contribute more so public services could be invested in, as well as things like tuition fees. Young people are not selfish, greedy people who only care about themselves. They actually care about society as a whole, and that's why Labour did far better than they were predicted.
Well, I didn't say that young people were selfish, greedy people. I just made the point that Jeremy Corbyn could have shut down the idea of dealing with historical debt, and he didn't, because he's a politician and he would try to hint at something that he wasn't promising at before the election, and now you've got Angela Rayner and John McDonnell trying to downgrade it to an ambition or a promise, or we never said we were going to do it. And I think the big problem is we've seen time and time again Labour politicians, Lib Dem politicians famously before the 2010 election, making promises on tuition fees, and then they get a bit fudged and watered down afterwards. And I think it's really good that loads of young people voted for the first time in the general election that we had a few weeks ago. And already it just feels a bit like politicians wiggling.
Well, no, because the manifesto makes it clear, and it's costed. You see, I don't want to rerun the election battle. Well, why not? It was fun. I enjoyed it. I mean, if we look back, the Labour manifesto was costed. The Tory manifesto infamously wasn't. It didn't. You'd struggle to find a single pound sign in it. And Labour had a costed plan for actually abolishing tuition fees. Look, Jeremy Corbyn has been accused of many things, but one of them is, he means what he says what he means, and that manifesto was what the stated policies of the Labour Party was, and that was abolishing tuition fees for those who start university, which they've costed. Obviously, if Labour come to power, and this interim Prime Minister makes way, and the government collapses, then, of course, tuition fees will be abolished in Britain.
OK, however, Labour Party didn't win, the Tories won, but only just, and they need the DUP to... Hold on a second, hold on a second, it's Matt's turn.
Theresa May's in,
only
Theresa
just, they
May's
need the DUP to support them,
won.
do they not, in order to try to get every single vote through the House of Commons. It's going to be a challenge. How long is she going to stay at number 10, do you think?
I mean, bluntly, I thought she would have resigned on the morning after the election when she was confronted with this total mess. I think the longer she stays there, the harder it is to see that she goes. I think getting through, there were lots of people who said she wouldn't even get through to the summer recess. What we have seen, I think, is a lot of people auditioning for why they shouldn't have the top job. So all of this manoeuvring by whether it's them or whether it's friends of them or allies or troublemakers, but whether it's David Davis, Boris Johnson, they were the people whose names were in the frame at the beginning. I wouldn't say they've got to the summer recess in a better place for becoming the next leader. So she gets to the party conference, maybe presses reset. We could just be stuck in this apparently unsustainable position for some time, I think. It's entirely possible, I think, she goes through now until 2019 at the end of the Brexit negotiations, and an awful lot of people in the Conservative Party, Conservative MPs and Conservative ministers who wanted to stay there, sort this mess out. They are terrified of a repeat of 1997, and they think their only hope really of avoiding that is having a total reset, new leader, almost new look party, and that has to come after the Brexit result. There isn't. Many of them think there isn't a way back for the Conservative Party where they swap Theresa May for David Davis or Philip Hammond or someone like that.
So I think when it was an absolute landslide, of course, for the Labour Party. The ball was in Jeremy Corbyn's court. He didn't manage to get over the line, and other sporting metaphors that I can't think of off the top of my head, Owen. But what is he going to do? What is the party going to do between now and the end of 2019? Well, again, no one won the election. That's the point. That's why we now have a coalition of chaos rather than strong and stable government, to coin a phrase. Theresa May had more political capital than any Prime Minister in history. No, she didn't. To win an election, you have to win a majority.
Well, she's Prime Minister. She's Prime Minister.
Yeah, but
she's Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn won the same number of seats as Gordon Brown won in 2010.
That's because she assembled a coalition of chaos with the DUP. Gordon Brown got about 28%. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got 40%. So look, yes, obviously,
they got the same number of seats.
No party made it over the line. That's why we have a hung parliament. That's why we have a coalition of chaos. In terms of what Labour has to do now, well, I think the one thing it can't do is obviously complacency. or hubris. I think the one thing we learned from Theresa May is don't get overly cocky about your chances. But clearly what Labour have to do is, for example, expand its foothold in Scotland. They obviously went from 1 MP there to 7. They need to... The last general election campaign, wrongly as it turned out, was a defensive campaign. So Labour ended up winning seats they've never won, like Canterbury, like the Socialist Republic of Kensington. And now, if they can win those seats, obviously if they have an offensive campaign, I'm campaigning in Boris Johnson's seat on Sunday, for example, which went from 10,000 to just over 5,000. Ian Duncan-Smith, he went from 8,300 to just over 2,000. So clearly there are lots of MPs, Tory MPs there who are sitting ducks. The other, though, is older voters. One of the things the Tories did is attack their core support, obviously, in the election campaign. So Labour have to keep focusing on what their offer is for older people, because if it wasn't for those over 65 who still support the Conservatives, Labour would already be on course for a landslide, and that's the big challenge really for Labour.
OK, Matt?
I think that's right. One of the things we don't know, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but what we don't know about the Labour Party is Jeremy Corbyn clearly built a coalition of support behind him. You've had people in traditional Labour areas who voted Leave, but he also won big in strongly Remain supporting areas. Where does his position on Brexit move to, and can he keep those two sides together? He also clearly enthused a whole load of people who haven't voted before, haven't voted Labour before, while also having Labour MPs who are out saying, you can vote for me because it's okay, Jeremy Corbyn isn't going to be Prime Minister. And it's in what way can he hold all that? Can he reassure people that he could be Prime Minister while holding on to those people who were very idealistic about what he was promising? I think he's got a big task ahead. I think actually he's got an easier task ahead than the one that Theresa May has got. I mean, she could be forgiven for disappearing into the Swiss mountains this summer while Jeremy Corbyn goes out and does his big rallies. I think keeping up this momentum, because who knows, he wants an election now. It could be a year, 2 years, 3 years before there's another one. Keeping up the momentum, seeming fresh and new and different is going to be a challenge, and holding together what is quite an unpredictable coalition is going to be difficult.
OK, I think disappearing up a Swiss mountain is going to be a new catchphrase. It's good to talk to both of you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you. They're great, aren't they?